In doing so, he picks and chooses what serves the point he is trying to make. He exercises his judgment as reader and writer alike. In this exercise, this activity, which is at the root of deepening judgment, he finds his essays. And it is at the root of Montaigne's success as a practicing author that he does so. Here the distinction between an education aimed at memory and an education aimed at judgment becomes especially clear in its importance. An education aimed at memory requires the participation of the student at the level of listening to the subject matter with a view toward being able to reproduce it. But the active work required to cultivate judgment transforms the student not only as a learner about subject matter, but as a learner about herself or about himself. In other words, the cultivation of judgment has a practical as well as an intellectual dimension in its potential for transformation of the student. Judgment may be the central faculty engaged in bridging the intellectual and the practical dimensions of human life. It is called for in both if an individual is to do more than parrot what others have taught, whether intellectually or practically. This is commensurate with and even necessary to education, it seems to me. For in its essence, education is less an apprenticeship than an awakening. If education is aimed at the whole person, and not just at some abstracted notion of the student as one who takes on subject matter in the manner of some beast of burden, then a transformation of self that might change a person's practice, whether in daily life or in a profession, would seem to be an important outcome. As I hope I've shown, if only in the broadest strokes, this is made possible by the cultivation of judgment. This potential for transformation at the level of practical life brings me to the third distinction on which my modest proposal in favor of an inefficient education relies. The distinction between educating with a view toward knowledge and educating with a view toward ability. Now, once again, it's a nuanced distinction. This is not to say that the two are incompatible. And so once again, we need to consider this carefully. To educate toward knowledge is to educate with a view toward the student's ability, in the most basic sense of the student being able to reproduce certain things, a mathematical formula perhaps, or a paradigm in a particular language, or a scientific experiment. Indeed, many of our most prevalent assessments of student learning are content-focused in this way, from state and federally mandated tests at key junctures in elementary and secondary school education, to the ACT and SAT scores that largely determine what institutions of higher learning our children will be allowed to enter. And of course, there is something important about an education that requires students to acquire content. Mathematical formulas must be known before they can be applied. Grammatical paradigms must be known before the meaning of a sentence or a paragraph or a book can be discerned. The elements operating in an experiment must be known before a theory can be supported by it. This is to say that an education geared toward knowledge is a perfectly worthy pursuit, and we should be glad to have such an education available to our students. But the ability I have in mind goes beyond the ability to reproduce something, and therefore an education geared toward knowledge must be understood as preparatory. And what I mean by ability is what we mean when we say that's an able person. If we don't cultivate that able person, we're back to the kind of transformation described by Montaigne as merely ornamental, and ornaments can weigh us down. If, however, the kind of transformation with which education is concerned is substantial, the learner's ability must go beyond acquisitions toward contributions of her or his own. It is precisely the ability to get out from under the burden of knowledge in order to make a contribution of one's own that suggests that education has achieved its essential, not ornamental end of transformation of the individual from one state or condition to another. It is the ability to make a contribution of one's own that manifests an education of substance in one who is big and strong enough to do so. Montaigne again helps us to understand more clearly this distinction between education whose end is knowledge and education whose end is ability by reflecting on the difference it can make in the life of the student. The language he uses may seem a bit foreign to our ears, and so we will need to listen carefully if we are to discern and therefore judge what he has to offer on this point. He writes, "I should be inclined to say that as plants are stifled with too much moisture, and lamps with too much oil, So too much study and matter stifles the action of the mind, which, being caught and entangled in a great variety of things, may lose the ability to break loose and be kept bent and huddled down by its burden. But it works the other way, for the more our soul is filled, the larger it becomes. And in the examples from olden times, we see as further proof to the contrary that able men in handling of public matters, great captains and great counselors in affairs of state, have at the same time been very learned. Now, Montaigne in this passage is foremost assuring us that the knowledge we acquire through education is not simply incompatible with being an able person.